Emily, we are ready for you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Brookes Barrack, and I'm with Emily Tritz. We are the co-founders of Kansas City Developmental Therapies. I am a speech-language pathologist, and Emily is an occupational therapist. We started KCDT 11 years ago. Seems like a long time ago. And now we're surviving a pandemic, right? And we're all trying to figure out how to regulate through all of this. So we are, if you don't know anything about us, we're the only DIR floor-time clinic in Missouri or Kansas. DIR stands for Developmental Individual Differences Relationship-Based. So everything we do for kids who are on the autism spectrum, for kids who come in with any kind of chromosomal differences, for kids who come in who are just working on the S sound, we really look at their developmental profile. Then we look at their individual differences, meaning motor planning, sensory needs, any kind of gastrointestinal needs. Like, we really look at the whole child. And then we put relationships at the forefront, meaning that we really think that once you build a trusting relationship with a kid or a teen, then they're going to work so much more with us and for us, and we're going to know a lot more about them. Part of the thing with KCDT is that we're really big into mentorship, and we're into continuing education and really using the most progressive evidence-based practices. So ways that we do that in our clinic is that we have a really well-known faculty member who mentors us. She's from Chicago, and she teaches globally, actually. So once a month, our therapists take turns and they present a case study, and we all get in on Zoom and we do a case study together as a group. And that really allows us to work together as a team. So even if a kid is coming and just getting occupational therapy, they're really getting the benefit of learning from our other speech language pathologists, other occupational therapists, physical therapists. We have a psychologist, and we have special instructors. So we really look at it as a whole child approach. And we do a lot of, every Monday, we do either our mentorship, we do continuing ed, we do just in-services for each other. And then once a year, we bring a really well-known continuing ed speaker to Kansas City. So we've brought Sherry Kahn, we've brought Sarah Ward, and last year we brought Dr. Barry Prezant, who wrote Uniquely Human. This year, unfortunately, we're not going to have an in-person continuing ed, but maybe we'll get to do something cool virtually. So that's just a little bit about us. And one of the reasons we wanted to share this presentation is because it kind of speaks to how we work and how we think, is that kids' development really isn't just, you don't develop fine motor skills, and once those are all developed, you develop gross motor, and then you develop language skills. It's all kind of working together. So we have to be able to work together as a team within our own scope so that we know best how to support a kid.
Okay, so I will get started. And I did want to mention, when you guys put your emails in the chat, I will send we'll send a PDF of these slides to Kathleen after the presentation. So then you'll have a copy of the slides. So I just wanted you to know that we can do that. So I will get started. Okay, so this quote, when we feel safe in body and mind, we can explore, take risks, and grow. We wanted to start with this because it really speaks to the idea that regulation is foundational to development. And Dr. Mona De La Hook is a psychologist out of California, and we really love her. Brookes talked about our presentations. We would love to bring her someday. But she wrote a book called Beyond Behaviors. And so you'll hear us referencing her a lot throughout the presentation. And we have the reference at the end of the presentation too for the book if you're interested. But we're going to talk a lot today about the importance of self-regulation and how it develops. But the other main point we're going to talk about is that bi-directional relationship between language comprehension and regulation, and the impact that those two things have on each other. So our hope is that you guys, I think we'll have mostly parents here, that you guys will leave this presentation feeling like you have some strategies and ideas for how to support your kids in development. So there are lots of different disciplines that talk about regulation. As therapists, I think we often think of it mainly in terms of sensory processing, but really one of the points we're going to talk about today is that there are so many things that contribute to how regulated a child is and just their overall state. And so sometimes this requires us to rethink the way we think about behavior, because what we really want to do is look at a child's behavior as them communicating to us about their internal state and what's happening on the inside. And then also I put on there, Brookes already sort of talked about this, but that relationship support regulation. And we want to talk about how essential the relationships that a child has with other people around them is to support their current regulation and also the development of their regulation. So there's lots of different definitions of self-regulation if you look online, and part of that's because there's so many different disciplines that talk about it. But one way we like to think about it is being calm, alert, and available. And what that means is being available for whatever it is that the child needs to be doing. So it could be available for learning, available for eating, available for communicating, available for doing their homework, whatever it is they need to do. And this is a developmental process that starts as infants and continues throughout the lifespan. So it's never too late to be working on a child's ability to self-regulate. The second part, it comes from the Star Center. And the Star Center is it's out of Colorado. It's Lucy Jane Miller started it, and they're sort of the experts on sensory processing. So we look to them to, in terms of our understanding of self-regulation. But they really talk about the importance of being adaptive, given the combination of stressors that a child faces during the day, both internal and external. And then the final quote is from Dr. Stuart Shanker, who is a researcher from York University. And you're going to hear us refer to him a lot throughout the presentation too. And he defines self-regulation as how we respond to stress. And he wrote an awesome book called, it's a long title, so I wrote it down. It's called Self-Reg, How to Help Your Child and You Break the Stress Cycle and Successfully Engage with Life. And it was a New York Times bestseller. It's a pretty mainstream book, but it's a really good book to help understand how stress impacts our regulation and where it all comes from, and how to help ourselves deal with it and also our kids deal with it. And also I wanted to point out that, like I said, we'll be talking about Dr. Mona De La Hook and Dr. Shanker, and their work sort of complements each other, but also both of them got their start in working with Dr. Stanley Greenspan and Serena Weider, who are the founders of DIR Floor Time, which is the approach that we use at our clinic. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on, this is from Dr. Stuart Shanker's model of self-regulation, but really the important part of it is that these are, he says, the 5 different areas that impact our self-regulation. So we have 5 different types of stressors, and they're all sort of interconnected and impact each other. So biological stressors is where we would think of like our sensory processing issues. And so any kids who are, really sensitive to touch or sensitive to movement or sensitive to smell, those would be considered biological stressors. But in that same category would be not getting enough sleep, not having a healthy diet, not eating a good breakfast on any particular day. So those would be biological stressors. And then we have social stressors, which would be, the stresses that come from interacting with other people or being a part of group activities. And then emotional stressors, those would be the stress that comes from dealing with strong emotions like anger, frustration, sadness, difficulty with transitions would fall under that one. Pro-social stressors are the stresses that we feel that come from dealing with other people's feelings. So having empathy for others, expectations of other people, sort of like the stresses that come in dealing with that. And then cognitive stresses. I think for kids, those can be cognitive tasks they do in therapy, do at school. For us, those would be maybe work tasks or managing things at home. So it's the idea that there's all these different types of stresses, but if you have a lot of stress in any one of these areas, then it limits your capacity to deal with stress in the other areas. So we need a balance in these, and it's just a good way to think about sort of where all the stress can come from for both us and the kids. So that goes along with this visual we really like, and it comes from the Star Center, but it's that same idea. They actually based it off Schenker's model too. And so it's the idea of thinking about each of us have a cup, and we have all these bubbles in the cup, and our cup contains sort of all the demands you would have during a day. So sensory input, attentional demands, cognitive demands, motor demands, and our biological needs. And it's the idea that we need all those bubbles to function. But if one of those bubbles gets too big and takes up most of the room in our cup, then if stresses come up in the other bubbles, we have less capacity to deal with those because this bubble's too big. So hopefully that makes sense. I think one example that recently related to COVID-19, which I think we can all relate to, is that we're doing teletherapy with lots of families, and sort of the theme that I would hear about a lot in my sessions is, lots more meltdowns, or, all of a sudden their tactile sensitivities are popping back up, or sensitivity to sounds. And the parents would be like, yeah, he used to never react to this stuff, and now he is. And so I think that's not a big surprise to any of us, but I think that this is a good way to sort of understand how that can happen, because there were so many other stresses that we were dealing with as families, and the kids were dealing with lack of routine and everything, all of the changes and the stress of their parents, that it's not a big surprise that then their sensory bubble was harder for them to deal with. And so I think that this can be a good way to sort of explain that variability that we can see with kids sometimes, especially in terms of their regulation. And then the other point here that I think that is important to remember is I'm talking a lot about our kids' cup, but at the same time, we all have our own cup. So as parents, our job in terms of our kids is to sort of figure out their strengths and weaknesses and how we can help sort of keep a balance for them and support them. But at the same time, we have our own cup. So if one of our bubbles gets too big, then that limits our ability to help our children deal with their stress and dysregulation. So now I'm going to shift to Brookes, and she is going to talk about this developmental pyramid and sort of the tie-in between regulation and language comprehension too.
Again, Emily, can you let me annotate?
I don't know if that's me or
It's not, no big deal.
I think Kathleen maybe.
Okay, it's not, no big deal. So
Ooh,
whenever
I might have just done.
Oh yeah, you got it, thank you.
Okay.
Whenever we have a new family come into our clinic and just want to know more about us, or when we do initial evaluations, I almost always write this on the whiteboard in our conference room, because it's really how we think, and we think this way shaped by neuroscience. And so down here at the bottom, if we think about this as how development happens, and how development happens, everything needs to happen kind of together, but at the same time, some things need to be really well developed so that we can keep working our way up the pyramid. And what happens is we could be working at the top of the pyramid, but then if stress occurs, we start going back down the pyramid. And so it all kind of hinges on each other and works together and can shift and flow at any time. And you probably see this with your kids, that sometimes you're having, like, maybe they have an awesome session or day or anything like that, and then the next day things aren't going as well. And so our job is to examine, like, where are we, meet them where they are, and then see what the just right fit is. So the kind of bottom of the pyramid for all of us is this innate primal need to feel safe. And it's this new kind of theory from Dr. Stephen Porges that we talk about a lot in our clinic. And it's that fight, flight, or freeze stage, right? And so if a kid is in fight, flight, or freeze, we're not going to be able to work on higher level thinking, right? We just have to get them back to that feeling safe. And so if they're there, we have to know what strategies help them feel safe. And then after that kind of comes regulation that Emily talked about, that calm and alert state. And what I've learned as a speech language pathologist working with so many wonderful OTs is calm and alert looks different for everyone. Calm and alert for some kids is sitting at a table, ready to go, making all this lovely shifting eye gaze to everyone and everything in the room. Calm and alert for some kids might be a really happy affect on their face, Whereas other kids who are like giggling and like kind of running away, that's not actually calm and alert, that's dysregulated. So this looks different, so we really have to know what calm and alert looks like for each kid. After calm and alert comes engaging and shared attention, right? That ability to like share ideas and affect. And after that comes reciprocity and intentionality. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But this is where a lot of our work as speech language pathologists and occupational therapists, really everyone in our clinic is working on reciprocity and intentionality, because intentions feed ideas, right? We want kids who have ideas and who are able to execute them. And we want kids who are reciprocal in their engagement. And then comes language comprehension. And what I hear, because I help with intake at our clinic, what I always hear is families who want kids to talk, right? We all want our kids to talk. But one thing we really look at is the language comprehension piece. And that's where we're going to focus today, because you have to understand before you talk, right? You have to understand and have a great depth of understanding. And I always compare it to, if you've ever tried to learn a second language, you're going to understand a lot more in that second language than you're able to produce, right? So after language comprehension comes language production, and then after that comes that higher level thinking, the pre-academic and academic skills. So if at any time your language comprehension is impinged, Emily, I think you actually have control of the marker, but it doesn't matter because I'll just talk about it this way. If at any time your language comprehension, if you're like, say that auditory noise, too much auditory noise, like in a gymnasium in PE with your classmates, is really hard for you, then probably understanding the directions from that PE teacher is going to be hard for you. And then you're going to start to go down, down, down the pyramid, right? And the same thing happens if you're already down in the pyramid, you can't access all your typical language comprehension. Emily, do you want to go to the next one? And we'll talk more about language comprehension. Okay. So processes underlying language comprehension. It's that ability to connect words that you hear to what you've already pictured in your mind. So you have to have good concept imagery and nonverbal working memory in order to have good language comprehension. It's recalling ideas from memory that are associated with prior experiences and words, and broadening and forming new meanings. So that's that idea that if I push on something and mommy or daddy says push, I connect those pieces, right? So you have to have that connection in order to have language comprehension. So signs of potential comprehension challenges. These are the kiddos that don't always respond to questions, comments, or directions. They might imitate what was said, or use scripted or echolalic language. Oftentimes we'll call that borrowed language in our clinic. They might be off topic, or their response might not connect to what you said. They'll show some general confusion, dysregulation, or anxiousness. So sometimes these kids are a little tricky. Sometimes it's very apparent, right, that a kid has a language comprehension challenge, but sometimes these are the tricky kids that you're like, I don't know, I was talking about this and then they were talking about this. Or it might be another therapist in the clinic coming to me saying, do you think there's something going on with so-and-so's language comprehension? Because I went to see him at his school and we were talking about going to the library, and all of a sudden he was like talking about outside with his friends, and it didn't seem to connect. So that's what we're looking at. We're looking for signs of potential comprehension challenges in kids.
Okay, so we're going to shift a little bit and talk about the development of self-regulation. So thinking about that developmental pyramid that Brookes just showed. So at the very base of it, that idea of feeling safe in the fight, flight, or freeze state. So we think of that as neuroception. So I'm not going to get too into it because it's a little bit complicated, but again, we have the references at the end so you could look more into it. But it comes from Stephen Porges's polyvagal theory, and it's the idea that our level of regulation depends on the underlying state of our nervous system. We have to feel safe in order to be regulated. And this could be conscious or subconscious, but it's happening all the time. And it's the idea of the brain's ability to sort of detect danger in the environment. So, you know, if you're in a more regulated state, you would be more equipped to deal with any new situations or challenging situations that come your way. But if you're in a not so regulated state, those same exact challenges, you might not even be able to begin them because of sort of where you're at physiologically. So when we think about this as therapists, especially in terms of our kids with sensory processing challenges, and of course lots of our autistic kids have lots of sensory processing challenges and can be very sensitive to sound or touch or movement. And so those kids who have those really sensitive nervous systems, their neuroception is sort of always biased towards detecting danger when there's no real danger. But so if you think about those kids, they, on a subconscious level, they're always at a heightened state because their nervous system is just sort of biased that direction. And so these are the kids who are reacting really quickly, or some kids who have behavior problems at school and no one can really tell where they're coming from, but it's because they, you know, it's coming from these regulatory issues because they're sort of biased that direction. So moving on to co-regulation. Relationships with another person can influence a child's neuroception and how safe they feel in any particular situation. So what we want to do as adults, as parents and therapists and teachers, is to sort of help co-regulate the kids to either help them stay regulated if we feel like they're in a good spot, or attain a state of emotional regulation. And so one of our main points of today is that you truly can influence the regulation of another person just by your relationship with them and your ability to co-regulate with them. And this sort of process of co-regulation leads to self-regulation and starts at birth, as we have babies and the parent's main job is to help soothe a baby and make them feel safe in the world. And that sort of starts the process of helping our kids develop these regulation skills. And all of us, our kids, need to be able to access the relationships around them for regulation, but we all do. We all need to access the relationships with our families, with our friends, with our peers, with our teachers, in order to have that optimal state of regulation. So again, co-regulation comes before the development of self-regulation. And really, they don't think that kids have the cognitive capacity to really be in control of their own self-regulation until developmentally about 7 or 8. So for some of our kids who are chronologically 7 or 8, but developmentally functioning less than that, then we would expect it to be even later for them. And when we're talking about having cognitive control over it, we're talking about the ability to independently use the tools they have. So really the brain's ability to look at a situation and think, of course, like in a subconscious level, have I experienced this before? Do I have a tool to deal with this? And so it's not until about 7 or 8 when kids can do that sort of cortical override of a fight or flight response. And so that's not to say that for kids younger than that, we wouldn't introduce these concepts, because we do. We introduce them even to preschool age, is start talking about tools to calm your body and using some of the zones of regulation tools. But it's just the idea that we wouldn't expect kids to be independent with using those until they're a little bit older. So, and again, that point that it's never too late to develop self-regulation skills or improve them, because it's a lifelong process. So I'm going to shift back to Brookes, and we're going to keep moving up that developmental pyramid to shared attention and engagement.
It would help if I unmuted. One thing we talk a lot in our clinic about is shared attention and what that looks like, especially as a speech language pathologist, because that's one of our primary goals, is to get shared attention, especially kids who are on the autism spectrum. That is typically one of the places our families report where they started maybe noticing something different with their kids, or why they started thinking about a diagnosis. And so it means having 2 or more people attending to the same object, but it also means exchanging information, and that can be through social referencing such as facial and body cues and gestures. So one thing we work a lot on in our clinic is for some of our kids, we're kind of silent in some of our sessions because we're working on shared referencing. So we don't talk about eye contact just for eye contact's sake. We talk about eye gaze and shared eye gaze and why it's important. So one of the things we talk about a lot, because it usually in neurotypical development, it develops before age 1, is triangular referencing. And that's that ability to, like, for this little girl, and she's obviously older than 1, but her ability to, if she looked down at the toy and then looked up at daddy, that would be triangular referencing. And that would be her body sharing with daddy, hey dad, share this toy with me, or share this joy in this toy with me. And it could even be as simple as mommy goes to work or goes to the store and daddy's home, and baby looks at, or toddler looks at the door and then looks at dad to say, hey dad, did you see mom leave, right? So there's lots of reasons that we use eye gaze, and most of them are for shared connection, right? And so that's what we're looking at. And then the other piece is a lot of our kids who are on the spectrum don't use shared gestures. And so that's something that we work on a ton. And some of that we have to work in conjunction with our occupational therapists and physical therapists to know about their motor planning and the motor development skills, because some kids might, their open hand point might be all they can do at this point. They might not be able to isolate that point. But we know that shared gestural use is very important for communication. So it's not something that we just like say, oh, they don't gesture, we're just not going to work on it. We work on it a ton, and not surprisingly enough, we work on it by modeling and making that part of our session, because we want that shared attention. And if you think about, again, a developmental pyramid and how things like build on each other, it starts in neurotypical development before you're a year old, but you keep using it the rest of your life. If you are in a classroom setting and the teacher is telling you something, but you're listening to a friend, and then you look around and all your friends are getting a textbook out or something, that's you using your shared eye gaze to say, oh, something's happening, right? And I need to be following along. So it continues to build. So we can't just say they don't have it and ignore it. We have to continue to build on it. How do we promote shared attention? So I talked about some of this, but we use our affect, and we have to find the affect that fits for the kid. So sometimes we need to use bigger affect, and that's me. I tend to be really big and loud and crazy. And for some kids, we need to be slower and lower. And we need to know about their visual processing skills to know how fast they can sense incoming things. And we need to know about their auditory processing skills, because we need to know how long we need to wait. Something that we do a lot of in our clinic is following the child's lead. That means their interest, ideas, intentionality, because then we're going to hook them a little bit quicker. We will also want to minimize effort, and I'll talk a little bit more about effort later on and the science behind effort and cognition and language development. And then also, if we are, at their level or below their level, it's going to help that eye gaze come to us. And then we're going to provide any supports that a child needs, and we'll talk about some of those later. Intentionality and reciprocity. So many of our kids and our teens are still working on this. So intentionality and reciprocity, that's that idea that I have an idea, I want to go up the slide, and I know how to make my body do it. And if something gets in my way, I know how to rework my plan. But it's also the idea from a language standpoint is, I'm thirsty. This is what thirst feels like in my body. I picture juice because I've had juice before. I can picture where the juice is in my kitchen. I can either go get the juice myself, or I have the tools either verbally or non-verbally with contact gestures to bring someone to the kitchen, to the door to help me get the juice, right? So that there's a lot of pieces that go into intentionality, but you have to have that idea first. You have to have an intention first. And so what we do is try to stretch out those intentions. And reciprocity, this is another thing that I'll hear from a lot of families, is that their kids are talking a lot, but they can't have a conversation. And so reciprocity, a lot of times we call it circles of communication, and it's that ability to have the continuous back and forth. And this really starts developing when you're a baby. It starts developing when mommy or daddy holds baby and you smile and then baby smiles back, and then you make a sound and baby makes a sound back. And it's just this back and forth, back and forth, back and forth that's rapid. And so a lot of times we talk about how many of those can we get going, right? And we don't want a kid just to be a responder. We want a kid to be an initiator. So we want a kid to have an idea and confidently know how to do it and be part of that back and forth. So when we talk about considering effort, this really goes hand in hand with the sensory and the regulatory piece, because effort or cognitive load means that at any time we only have a finite capacity of cognitive resources to use. And effort can at times be too much, even within typical development. And so we have to think about how much work a child is putting into any one thing. And what we know from neuroscience is that language is a capacity that often moves in the background. That means it's the quickest thing to go. And if you've read any work by any autistic adults, that's what they'll tell you too. When life is stressful for them, so there are many, many very functioning autistic adults who have written books, who are speakers places, and Emily and I have met many of them. We've been really fortunate to meet some of them at some different conferences, and they will tell you the first thing that happens to me is that my language starts to go. And some of them use different devices, or some of them have different ways to get around that. But they'll say, if life is really heavy for me, my language goes first. And I think that's really important for us to know about kids, because then we have to know if things are stressing or if there's too much effort on a kid, where is our just right language match for them? And it can shift at any time. And I just put on there, can you recall a time when you were heavily focused on a task and or otherwise compromised, and how easy it was for you to respond to questions, engage in simultaneous interactions? And I think we can all probably think about this during the pandemic. So if any of you were working and trying to homeschool, or just trying to homeschool and manage life during all of this, I can think of many times where our clinic is back open, so we're primarily in our clinic now, but when we were shut down and doing all teletherapy, and I was trying to, have 3 children, trying to get them what they need while my husband and I are working, that they would like come interrupt me while I was typing an email, and I was trying to focus on them and trying to focus on the email, and they would walk away, and I would notice that I'd been like typing what I was talking to them, right? Like you only have so much effort. And the other piece where kind of Emily was talking about that bidirectional is that if you're going to the doctor and they say you might have bad news, or maybe you think there might be something that they're going to tell you that might not be great as pre-COVID, they would tell you to bring another person or something to write down what the doctor says, because you start to shift down when you're given bad news, and you're probably not going to remember or know to ask all the right questions in that time, because your language abilities are shifting down as well. So questions to ask ourselves when we're working with kids or just with our own children. Is the child hungry, thirsty, sleepy, or sick? And actually, if anyone's read any of Dr. Dan Siegel or Dr. Tina Payne Bryson's work, they often use the acronym HALT: hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. So before you do anything with the kid, halt and think, are they any of those things? Does the environment support the child's physical and sensory needs? Are there any emotional stressors that might be hindering the child's ability to engage and communicate? What is the just right challenge at this point in time? And so sometimes that just right challenge, like I'll tell you about an activity we did with a kid last week at the clinic that was the just right challenge, and we were silent. Mom and I were silent for about 20 minutes, which is probably antithetical to like speech language pathology, right? That I was silent, but we were working on affect cueing, shared eye gaze, problem solving, and gestural use. And so for this kiddo, he loves certain farm animals. That's what he comes into the clinic, and he wants those animals, and it really helps decrease his stress to have those and see them. And then we play with them. But before he came in, I had taped them up in different places all over the clinic. He gets there first, no one else is there, so we have them scattered among the clinic. And I taped his favorite one right within eyesight when he came in, so he kind of already knew the game. And then Mom and I turned our voices off, and we pointed and we shared eye gaze, and he found 10 of those. He was regulated the entire time. If we had been giving him all the verbal cues, that would have been too much, right? He was moving around a stool to climb. It would get stuck, and he would come over and say, oh, stuck, help me. And we would take it off together because he doesn't love the sticky, but because we had taken down the language piece, the language effort, he was able to totally engage and stay regulated and complete that task.
Okay, so we're going to shift and keep talking about strategies. But before we do that, I think we've talked a lot about the things we talked about, what regulation looks like and the things that can sort of dysregulate a child. But really, when we think about what does dysregulation look like, and Brookes talked about this a little bit, and it's the idea that it doesn't look the same for every kiddo. And it also, I think the first image that we usually get in our head is those kids who are in fight or flight and maybe running away or hitting people or spitting or some of those more undesirable behaviors. But it's, there are kids that we see in the clinic and their dysregulation is more like running around or uncontrollable laughing or just lots of silliness. Or for some kids, it's even the more subtle, like rocking in your chair, chewing on your shirt. We just, and it's that idea that we sort of have to be detectives and figure out like, okay, what's happening? Another little guy we see, he kind of, you can tell when things are going south for him because he kind of hoards his toys and keeps them in a pile and just wants to look at them. And that's sort of his way of pulling it back together. But it's just, we have to look at it for each individual child. And I think as parents, I think that you guys are often the ones that really know those kind of subtle behaviors. And so it's important that the whole team works together. So the whole team knows like, okay, well, he just left this activity and I think maybe he's starting to get a little frustrated, or, so that everybody sort of knows those signs and can help them hold it together through a hard activity or hold it together before a big meltdown happens. And so we like this iceberg analogy because sometimes we talk about expected and unexpected behaviors, and those unexpected or undesirable behaviors are sort of what we see on the top, but really we're more concerned with what's going on below the surface and sort of what's happening inside the child to make them have those behaviors. So we're, again, sort of reframing the way we're thinking about those behaviors in order to figure out what's really happening. So what are the ways that we can help our kids become more regulated in order to support them in the tasks they need to do, right? Because of course, we want them to be regulated, but it's not just for the sake of being regulated. We want them to be regulated to be able to participate in the activities of their life and to be able to comprehend language and use language and all of those things. So we have this graphic that we found on Dr. Schenker's website, and it's a little bit cheesy, but it really gets at really one of the most effective strategies that you can do to help regulate a child is to co-regulate with them and also be their person who sort of understands what's happening with them and can help figure out like, okay, I think that was a little hard, but maybe if we do this, or maybe if we support them in this way, then we can help them through it. And I think that it requires, again, that paradigm shift. And we try not to really think about behaviors as good behaviors or bad behaviors, or labeling kids as good kids or kids who misbehave or aggressive kids or kids who run away all the time, sort of getting away from those labels and just thinking about the fact that we're going to think about the behaviors for what they're trying to tell us and what they can tell us about our kids' inner state. So when we're talking about environmental supports and things we can do in our environment to help the kids, well, primarily we really like that idea of time in versus time out, because again, it goes along with the co-regulation idea. So it's that idea, if you have a dysregulated kiddo and you send them to timeout or you put them in your room, that if they're already dysregulated, isolating them from everyone else isn't going to support their regulation. But it's that idea of time in where maybe you take them to their room or you sit with them in a chair, and not that you're saying it's okay, you can do whatever you want, but instead you're saying, okay, what happened here? Let's wait until I can see that you feel better, and then we're going to figure out what happened. But just that idea of that's how we support kids in developing their own regulation, is by starting with that co-regulation first. And so once you do that, then you can sort of help establish, like, this is a calm place for you. Oh, wow, look how much better you feel when you took a break and you went to your room, or I got you in your quiet spot. I mean, some kids like to be in a closet or in a tiny space between their couch and their wall. But it's also that idea you're combining that with the co-regulation to help them know, like, I can help you. I can help you find a place where you feel safe and you can calm down. And then, of course, it would be different for everyone, but we would eventually want to create sort of a calm down space or a reset room where you would have things in there that you know would support your kids. And again, those can be different for everyone's. Books, chewies, tactile toys, special blankets, weighted blankets, there can be anything you could put in there. But one of those pictures has the little calm down toolbox in it, but it also made me think sometimes I recently did it with a kiddo in a preschool classroom who was having a really hard time, and there wasn't a great place in the classroom for him to have like a break spot. So we used sort of a bigger plastic bin that feels like a nice cozy space for a preschool sized kid. And so he would sit in there, and there was a blanket and books in there, and we sort of pushed it back by the cubbies so that then when he needed a break, he could go sit in his little box. And he liked the pressure of the walls around him, and also the fact that it felt like an enclosed space. And so that's another way of, sort of creating a cozy space, and if you feel like you don't have one available. Okay, so Brookes is going to talk more about some visual strategies that we can use.
So one thing I always talk to families about is how we can increase visual supports for a kid, because before we start to say this kid is misbehaving on purpose or purposefully not listening to me or following directions, I want to make sure with 100% certainty they understand what is being asked of them. And one thing we can do to help support that is to use more visual supports. And so that might come in the way of like predictable schedules, consistent routines, picture schedules, first then, all of that kind of stuff. But it also can mean for some of our kids who are using some verbal language, we still need to help support them. So AAC, alternative and augmentative communication, that can actually mean, a device for a kid who is primarily non-speaking, or it can mean for some kids who are primarily speaking that they still use those kind of supports when they're under stress. And so we have kids at our clinic who are primarily speaking, but use some text to speech because that really helps with their language comprehension. So maybe with schoolwork, they're using some text to speech so that they, even though they might be able to read and decode, if they can, for writing, say, type it and listen to it, they're going to be far more successful. Or if a question is more complex, they're going to be far more successful seeing it than just hearing someone say it, because speech is very fleeting. Also, even like with the advent of smartphones and iPads and everything else, it's just so easy to help create quick visual supports for kids. And I mean, I can tell you, even in my own life, I have 3 kids. One of them was on the spectrum. And when he was younger, if we went to like one Mexican restaurant versus another, he liked rice, but I wanted him to have that image in his head of what we were going into. And so saying rice to him and saying the name of the place might not have helped make that image. So I would show him, maybe red rice at this one restaurant versus white rice with the green at this other. And I would show him pictures and say, this is the one we're going to, so that he would know, so that when we got there, he didn't have this big meltdown that seemed crazy because he had in his head a picture of something that didn't happen, right? So as much as we can to support that visual imagery is going to help support language. So I never want anyone to think of visuals as a crutch. I want them to think of visuals as support, and that support that can change over a lifetime, or maybe even not be needed all the time, but on some days or during the pandemic, maybe it's needed more often. So some ways we also use visual supports is writing social stories, using some different just visual supports timers. Sometimes visual timers can be a little tricky because our kids who use visual pieces as anchors might get so into the visual piece of the timer they lose engagement with the game. So you kind of, again, you have to know their individual differences. And social stories, you can write them and print them out. But again, there are great apps for creating them. You can just have pictures on your iPad or on your phone and you can talk about things. I love to talk about things after they've happened, or print really cheap pictures and put them in just a little, cheap like dollar Walmart photo album and talk about the day. I mean, one really important piece of language is able to think about past experiences and relay them to someone else. I mean, that's a huge part of communication. And so one way we can do that is maybe if mom or dad's not with the kid all day long, is if we have some of those pictures and at the end of the day, we could go through them. And even with a non-speaking or primarily non-speaking kid, we can talk about, oh, remember today we went and played at the park and you went on the slide. Daddy, did you know he went on the slide today? And it's another way to share language with that visual anchor.
So I think everybody's familiar with there's lots of different sensory and motor activities that can be calming or alerting for different kids. And I think it's just the idea that we need to figure out for each kiddo which type of activities benefits them the most. And we put on here as a point, I think it's important to point out that the STAR Center, again, the experts in sensory processing, are really sort of moving away from that old concept of a sensory diet and moving away from that idea that an OT or another professional can give you a very specific sensory diet for your kiddo, that they need to do these things in the morning in exactly this way, and then at lunch they need to do these 5 things, and then after dinner they need to do these 5 things, and that will help them function optimally, because we know it doesn't really work like that. And so they're really moving away from that idea of a sensory diet and talking more about a sensory lifestyle and figuring out your child's unique profile or your unique profile to help you support your child, and sort of working those things into your life with the understanding that we know sensory needs don't stay the same. They sort of ebb and flow, and you might need different things at different times, but it's just that idea that we're aware of our individual differences, we're aware of our child's individual differences, and then we support them in the best that we can. But that being said, once you know your child's sort of sensory profile, this goes along with that idea that we're not expecting our kids who are 4, 5, 6 years old, even 7 years old, to be like, okay, my body needs to calm down. I'm going to go get my tunnel. And, and some kids, if we work really hard, they might get there earlier. But what we can do is, once we know what kinds of activities support them and things that are really calming for them, if we want to sort of move towards that increasing their independence, we can make them a choice board. And this example on here has a lot of choices. So maybe you might start with a couple, or in the clinic, we ended up making, like, we have 4 by 6 photos, like printed photos from CVS, that we can hold up a couple or tape 3 of them to a whiteboard, and we'll say, oh, you look like you need to swing. Do you like any of these? And sort of giving them that power and control of making a choice of what they want to do, but also we're really only presenting choices that we know will benefit them and are beneficial to their sensory profile. So, and then once you know that, there's tons of books and websites and Pinterest boards that you can use if you know, oh, my child really loves deep pressure. What are some other deep pressure ideas that I can come up with? Then you can we help families look into more options for those, or things that will work in their house with the things that they have. So I just wanted to put some more examples on here. And again, these are things that can be calming for lots of kids, but that's not to say that, if you have a kiddo who's sensitive to sound, all you got to do is stick a pair of headphones on them, because there's plenty of kids who can't tolerate headphones. And same with weighted vests. I have families who are like, well, they told me to wear a weighted vest, but I put it on him and he just screams the whole time. And I'm like, well, then it's not worth it, because if we're thinking about regulation, we want to do things that support them. So if you're forcing kids to use any of these supports because sometimes I'll say, oh, I just know he would like it if he gave it a chance. But it's that idea of, if kids are dysregulated through the supports, that's not going to work. So, but again, so some kids like headphones, some kids really, oral motor things do really great for them. For older kids, even gum. But for the younger kids, chewies, or even blowing bubbles, or like this picture at the bottom is he's doing a game, we call it Bubble Tub or Bubble Mountain. But lots of kids really love the visual input they get from watching the bubbles rise up. But the whole point of the game is that it helps, once the kids are able to blow themselves, is that it sort of promotes taking deep breaths, and it can be a very calming activity. But again, the other thing we really like, and I think it's really nice because places in the community are starting to do this too, but just having like a regulation backpack or a fanny pack or something that either you can carry or your child can carry with tools in it that you know will be helpful or that you know are calming to your child. And again, those are different for everybody. And then as kids get older, we sort of, and sensory needs sort of change, but they still need that sensory input. We like to try to talk about what kinds of leisure activities we can get them involved in that will be supportive to their sensory profile. And so I know I keep repeating it, but it's just that idea of it's not a one size fits all. And I think sometimes with sensory strategies, even other professionals are like, oh man, he's getting upset, talk to the OT. Okay, take him to the sensory gym, he needs to swing. And that may be the case, but also we can't expect like, oh, he's upset, put the weighted vest on him, that'll help him, or put him on the swing, that'll help him. That nothing really happens in a vacuum. And so we can't just put the sensory strategy in place and expect the child to pull it together. Because, in my swing example, Brookes and I used to work at a little therapeutic preschool. And so sometimes, other people might say, okay, well, he's upset. And every time you take him to the sensory gym, then he comes back and he's better. And so, yes, the swinging's probably helping, but it also probably helps that the para or the therapist or the teacher who took him to the sensory gym for that break also has a nice supportive relationship and was helping to co-regulate them at the same time. So it's just like never forgetting about that relationship piece that is so important to regulation. And I'm not going to go into these, but we do use some of these curriculum as we're trying to do those more cognitive pieces of developing self-regulation as kids get older. So we use zones of regulation a lot. We use tools from the ALERT program, which is really just another way of helping kids identify what state they're at. And then there is another self-regulation program called Regulation Rocket, which is an OT out of Australia. And she has some really good ideas for regulation and talking about co-regulation and that kind of thing too. And then in the clinic, in our sessions, we do a lot of modulation games for those kids who, go from 0 to 60 really quick. We'll do a lot of like slow, fast, medium movements, or slow, super slow, fast, really fast, and just kind of getting them used to that concept of different degrees of regulation. And also that you can do that same thing with volume games, playing musical instruments, soft, super soft, loud as we can, that kind of thing. So that's another way that we work on it in the sessions.
Yeah, and what's interesting is like when Emily is talking, a lot of the things they do in their sessions, we do in our sessions as SLPs. We're just looking at it from some ways in the same way, but some ways differently, right? Like those modulation games we play often too. But what I'm doing when I'm playing Ring Around the Rosie with the kid who likes that kind of like movement, either me holding them or us holding hands and playing, and we do it quiet or loud, I'm also thinking about how if I'm quiet and I'm using the word quiet, that word is probably going to lock in, right? Because there's that movement and that emotional memory tied into the word, and aha, now we have a functional word in our vocabulary, right? So, and I didn't talk too much about this, but we rarely use flashcards and things to help work on vocabulary building because it's not really, there's been tons of studies that show it doesn't really turn into functional language. We think about how we can connect movement, sensory pieces, emotional memories to language, and then how that connects to make for more functional language use. So when Emily's talking about those modulation games, we play them, but I'm thinking about it from the perspective of this is going to connect, right? This is going to connect and last, and they're going to have this word. Other ways we can also help support language comprehension is using a lot of gestures. So this is something we use a lot, and a lot more wait time. Wait time is so important for our kids, and they've done studies on some kids who take 90 seconds to process auditory language. I mean, think about how long that is to say something to someone and then have to wait a minute and a half for them to respond. So my rule of thumb is, and I'm a talker, that I have to say something and then wait 5 to 10 seconds before I say something else. And I feel that the kid's not responding because my language is too high, then how do I bring it down, or how do I help support my language with more visual support? And that might mean pointing, that might mean, it could mean lots of different gestural supports and facial expressions. It can mean changing my intonation, right? Making the prosody, that musicality of my voice a little bit more to get their attention. And one thing that we always talk about when possible, to use experiential learning. So viewing going swimming with your kid as therapeutic instead of just like a fun family thing, but as therapeutic, because you're going to lock in so many more functional word usage and language comprehension, along with that sensory piece of giving them all that deep pressure swimming, than by maybe them sitting and doing therapy with me all day long, right? Going to the zoo and seeing animals, smelling animals, doing all of that kind of stuff is going to lock in vocabulary towards the zoo more than anything that I can do in my therapy session or in conjunction with what I do. So as much as possible, using experiential learning to help with language comprehension is something that we talk about a lot when able, when the world is open, right? Okay, and I think that is about it. We just have some resources on our slide, and that should give us just a few minutes if anybody wants to ask any questions. You could